Hello, I'm Denys Damon, a Catholic philosopher attempting to escape the meaning crisis. This past week, someone attempted to assassinate Donald Trump, and I am utterly and completely unsurprised. My lack of surprise is not because I had some secret knowledge about who, when, and where an assassination attempt would occur, nor is it because I'm convinced that the hatred of Donald Trump was sure to produce an assassination attempt. No, the reason I was totally and completely unsurprised is that I have been carefully studying a book by Plato, Plato's Republic, for the last 8 years. Now, bear with me, there is a connection here. At the beginning of the Republic, Plato sets up a situation. The philosopher Socrates is headed up from the Piraeus with his friend Glaucon when someone sees him from far off and sends his slave boy off to stop Socrates. The slave boy tells Socrates, "Wait here, my master is coming." So Socrates waits, and the master arrives. His name is Polemarchus, and he says, "Socrates, I see you're going up, but I want you to come back down. I want you to come and spend the evening chatting with me and my friends. It'll be pleasant. It'll be fun. You should come." Socrates says, "I have business elsewhere. I'm headed up. Why should I go back down?" Polemarchus, who is surrounded by his friends and slaves, says, "Well, how many of there are you and how many are there of us?" "There are clearly more," Socrates responds. He says, "Could you overpower us if we attempted to force you?" Socrates says, "Well, no, I could not prevent you if you all attempted to force me." And Polemarchus says, "Well, suppose then that we would force you if you said no, and then say yes. Your alternatives are either say yes or be forced." And Socrates, always there with the wise question, asks, "Isn't there a third alternative? Wouldn't it be possible for me to persuade you to let me go? To persuade you to not be violent towards me?" Polemarchus, still thinking they're having a grand joke, says, "Well, could you persuade me if I refuse to listen?" And Glaucon, Socrates' companion, not Socrates himself, interestingly, but Socrates' companion says, "Absolutely not. It would be impossible to persuade you if you refuse to listen." Polemarchus replies, "Well then, assume we won't listen, and then make your choice." This situation is the beginning of Plato's long meditation on the nature of human beings, the nature of politics, on the nature of what is good for us human beings. It sets up one of the basic situations of humanity, which is that the only alternative to violence is persuasion. But the moment that people choose to stop listening, choose to close their ears to any and all persuasion, all that is left to them to get what they want is violence. The alternative to violence is persuasive conversation, the capacity to change other people's minds, and of people to listen enough to have their minds change. Now, how does this enable me to be utterly unsurprised that someone attempted to assassinate Donald Trump? Not that I'm condoning it in the slightest. I just wasn't surprised because for generations and generations now, our culture has been slowly but surely losing the tools that allow for actual persuasion. Persuasion is not what happens when you see an advertisement and find that all of a sudden you have an unimaginable craving for French toast flakes or whatever strange new invention the cereal companies have come up with recently. No, persuasion is what happens when someone offers you reasons and you're convinced by them. You see the truth in what the other person says. But persuasion, reasoning with other people, assumes that other people not only will listen, but have the capacity and interest and desire to listen in the first place. On this channel, I talk a lot about the meaning crisis. I believe that our world, our culture as a whole, is going through a meaning crisis. We've lost the ability to find meaning, to find arguments that can persuade and convince each other. We don't have the cultural vocabulary that would enable us to listen to people, to actually understand what the other person is saying, to make that effort, to see a different perspective, and to see what convincing arguments there could be. And then to be persuaded, it's not just to have convincing arguments, but to have some standard by which you can judge, is what that other person's saying true? And if it's true, will I base my life off of it? I am unsurprised that someone tried to assassinate Donald Trump because there was no other alternative left. We have been cultivating an attitude of neglect of discourse, neglect of reason, neglect of reasoning, of persuasion, of actual conversation for generations now. Violence was going to come eventually. Plato goes on in the Republic to analyze the descent of political forms towards ever greater evils. And he describes situations that are shockingly similar to our own cultural moment, to our own political moment. I think that the only way that we can understand what's happening in our world right now is by understanding the understander. Who are these people who can, in theory, be convinced by reasons, whose only alternative is not violence? That assassin, that lone gunman, he had an alternative, at least in theory. If his culture had been the kind of culture that could have listened, he could have made an argument that maybe would have persuaded people. And then he wouldn't have had to resort to violence. The only way to avoid more violence, the only way that will prevent more and more insanity in our culture at large is by looking within and asking ourselves, am I the kind of person who listens to reasons and who gives them? Have I cultivated the capacity to persuade and to be persuaded? Am I aware of my own ignorance, of my own gaps, of my own lack of understanding? And could I maybe seek to understand the people around me and the issues themselves, the things that divide our country so viciously and now violently? Could we cultivate the kind of culture that doesn't choose the horrible last resort of violence? That's the project here at the Hidden Center. If you want more, if you want to help me, to join me as I look for meaning in the midst of a meaning crisis, as I try to escape from the cave, the chains that bind us and push us inexorably towards greater and greater violence, please stick around. See if we can understand what it is to be human, and hopefully avoid further bloodshed.